So, here's my first question to you. When is a mark a line? Come on.
When is a mark a line?
When is a mark a line? Or maybe a better way to start would be, when is it not a line?
When you
Right.
put it on paper, as soon as you touch the board or the paper, I don't know.
Okay, okay. All right, let's think about it. Okay, can we all agree that all three of those are marks? Okay. Is one of those marks also kind of like a line? Which one is more like a line?
First,
The top one? Yeah, okay, all right, good, we're in agreement. Okay, what is the quality of that, right? Because this is different from this, our most traditional sense of a line, right? So what's the thing that these two have in common?
It has an end in the beginning.
An end and a beginning? Yeah, that's true, right? A clear sense of an end and a beginning. It has a sense of direction, and it has length, right? Like that length is its predominant thing about it, right? That like that going from point A to point B is the most distinct thing about that mark, right? The word length and the word line, right? Both come from similar roots, Indo-European speaking, right? Everyone see that connection? So that's the thing, like all marks could be lines as long as they go somewhere. They go from a point to another, okay? When is a mark a shape?
when one point connects the other point, like, I don't know.
Well, once again, of these four now, we have four different marks up here on the board. Of these four, which one seems most like a shape to you?
Yeah.
Okay, right, everyone agree? Raise your hand if we all agree.
Close, I guess.
Yeah, okay, so most like shape. And here's the thing, like a lot of this stuff is not, it's not hard, right? It's not like, but we're gonna struggle with it first because we're constantly gonna second guess ourselves, like, oh wait, maybe I could be wrong. Because sometimes we will be wrong, but that's okay, right? Don't worry about it. So yeah, this one is the most like a shape, right? So what makes it the most like a shape? It doesn't have A to B, right? But then this one too also meets that category, right?
Shape, too.
The little tiny dot, right? So what's the difference between this and that? Right? Yeah, maybe.
Like bigger and bigger.
It is bigger, right? Scale is basically the only thing, really, that's different between this and that. Like, if we zoomed up on that, right? If we took a photograph of that really, really close, where that mark filled most of our picture frame, right? It would be a shape just as much as this is a shape. Really, right? Scale is the main thing. One way to think about when is a mark a shape is really relative, right? Just like this is relative, because that's a mark that's also a line. That's a mark that's also a line. But what about that? Or that, right? When the length gets short enough, all of a sudden, it doesn't seem all that much like a line, right? Does that make sense? But a lot of that has to do with, like, you make a mark like that on this big board, and it seems way more like a mark, just a plain old mark, than it does like a line. You put that in a composition that is that size, right? And it feels like a line. Does that make sense? Okay? So there's always a gray area here. We're not talking about, like, we can define exactly when a mark is always a shape. But one way to think about it would be to say it's a shape when it has both length, and width, right? When it has clear measurable dimension in multiple directions. Or another way to say it would be to say it's a shape when you could draw a line that's a contour around it, right? This shape right there, even though I didn't make it that way, but I could do this. Right? I could describe it with a contour line around it. Does that make sense? Right? And so if it really looks like something that I could do that to, right? Because once again, when we think of shapes, we think of this, right? We think of geometric shapes that we were taught in school, but this is as much a shape as that, right? Okay. All right. So now we have a good sense. And so when is a mark only a mark? This is kind of a trickier kind of question. I mean, I guess this becomes the answer, right? When it's neither, when its length is not predominantly the main thing we see, and when its area or circumference is not the predominant thing we see, right? When just it being a moment, whether it's a dot or a flick, right? When that is its predominant character, then we could say that's a time when a mark is just a mark. So, first question we have to ask ourselves about what we've done so far in the sketchbook is, did we really push those boundaries? Did we explore a lot of times when our marks are lines, a lot of times when our marks are more like shapes, and a lot of times when our marks were clearly not lines or shapes? And I think the answer is probably going to be, for most of us, yes on the first one. We did a lot of marks that were very line-like, right? And that makes sense because the tools we were using, pencils and pens and markers, are all very much designed to make lines, right? Does that make sense? And because most of our training, whether drawing training or just learning to write, is about making lines. That makes sense? So we probably all did really well when it came to lines, right? But exploring our marks being more like shapes or exploring our marks being more like not a line or a shape, we probably could push ourselves further on, right? Okay, so that's point number one. Okay, so how do marks vary? We've already talked about that first kind of issue of like how much are marks like lines, how much are marks like shapes. What are other ways that marks vary? Yeah, because you could put a mark, right, like that, and a mark like that, okay? And so there are two ways that those two marks are different. You mentioned one, color, and you kind of hinted at another one when you said shade. What's the two differences between those two marks? One is color, because one pretty much has no hue, right? And that it's not reflecting any particular hue at all, being black. And one, because it does have hue, it has a distinct hue of being kind of this green, slightly on the blue-green side, right? Okay. But what's the other difference between those two marks? We could do the same thing if we used our marker, like our 5-point Sharpie and our pencil, right? But they wouldn't be different in color, right? Because, I mean, the graphite technically is a little bit different in color. It's kind of warmish, and it's kind of on the green side. But most people never notice that graphite has any color to it. Raise your hand if you've ever noticed graphite actually having color. Because it does, right? It's distinct in color from like charcoal. It's different in color from, and actually various types of charcoal are different in color from each other, but we'll just let that slide. So for right now, what is the main difference between making a mark with our graphite and making a mark with like our Sharpie?
The size?
That is true, the width of the line, right, when we think about it, right? So we could when a mark is like a line, there is width. So far we talked about width and color. What else? What if you even specifically made your graphite line just as thick? Hmm? Say that again? Density. Yeah, you're getting close, right? The word I would expect you would say is one is darker, right? The word we use in design class is value. In design, right, among the art elements, there's line, shape, and the very third one is always value. And value is the lightness or darkness of things, okay? And one of the things that's tricky for a lot of people, this is why we have a whole class on color theory, is that there's a value difference between these two things. There's a color difference between them, but there's also a value difference. We know there's a value difference because if we took a black and white photograph of this would come out like a pretty light gray, and this would not. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so width, color, value, what else? Think of, you guys just made a whole bunch of marks. What are other ways that marks can vary? And by the way, density is a good issue because on a different front. And I think that that's going to be a really important issue when it comes to pushing yourselves on your sketchbooks, right? Density, there's this kind of density of like, right? How hard did it press? How saturated was that mark, right? Because like, let's say you have two Sharpies and one of them is kind of old, right? And the ink's starting to not be all that solid, and then another one is brand new. And with the one that was old, you used a very light hand, and the one that was brand new, you drew like you were a 5-year-old, right? You'd have a very different density of mark between the two marks, even though the basic value of the ink is the same, okay? But there's a different kind of density, which is the difference between this and that, right? Like how much